Good evening, I'm Polly Halstead. I'm a community activist for 10 years after arriving in Nevada City. I manage Stryker House, the first adult community day center in Nevada County. I'm on the board of the Peace and Justice Center and a member of the Community Oversight Task Force. One of the most basic interactions a citizen can have is encountering a police officer. It's completely unacceptable for people of color, the poor, houseless, mentally ill, or substance addicted, or someone having the worst day of their life, that some of these routine interactions are grounds for fearing for one's life. Following the George Floyd murder by a trained police officer and supervisor, communities and cities across the nation are demanding transparency and accountability in law enforcement. The Nevada County community is also interested in reforming and upgrading our law enforcement responses following the shooting deaths of Gabriel Strickland and Sage Crawford. Our Community Oversight Task Force has taken a deep look into Sheriff's Office policies and state mandated trainings. Tonight we are reporting our findings to the public. We will make recommendations for implementing new programs to better serve the needs and safety of our communities. Law enforcement officers must act without bias and be respectful of the public they serve when responding to people in crisis. Our work is to ensure Nevada County law enforcement agencies act lawfully and are fully trained in accordance with police officers' standards and training required by the state. The consequence of law enforcement's deadly use of force in the United States is lawsuits. Hundreds of millions of dollars per year are paid in restitution to victims of police misconduct. Nevada County and the Sheriff's Department within the last 2 years have settled 2 lawsuits out of court. 2 are pending trial. The civil lawsuit in the Gabriel Strickland case is asking $10 million for wrongful death. We can live in a country where police don't kill people unnecessarily. First, by limiting uniformed and armed responses to many crisis situations. Second, creating effective civilian oversight. And third, ensuring accountability. Getting rid of officers who do not follow state-mandated training and written policies and procedures is the first step. So first we're going to take a look at the shooting deaths of Gabriel Strickland and Sage Crawford. In the Union article, they named Brandon Tripp and Taylor King as the deputies involved in the Strickland shooting. For the Crawford shooting, it was the deputies were Caleb Toterin and Matthew Harrison. In both videos, we can see that there was a rapid escalation of the event. The verbal instructions to drop the weapons were not working. Deputy Tripp was yelling and swearing. And what we learned about police training is that in cases where there are people who are mentally ill or have or on drugs or have physical disabilities, they're not going to respond in the same way to law enforcement instructions as a normal person. So the officers are trained to use different communication skills. And these 2 shootings, and none of those things were used. One of the mistakes that the deputies made was coming out from behind cover and advancing on the subject. So in the case of the Gabriel Strickland shooting, he was completely surrounded. He had not committed a crime, and the deputies, thinking that he had a real rifle, still advanced towards him. They kept advancing as they were talking. You would think that if they thought he had a real rifle, that they would have been more careful, but they kept advancing on him anyway. And this is a really important point. There was no request of a crisis team supervisor or crisis team or mental health professional or anything. They didn't stop the situation and ask for help. This happened in both situations. The other situation that resulted in the death of these two young people was that the tasers did not work. This, we believe, was the fatal factor that led to their death. The officers or deputies kept advancing on them till they were very, very close, and then tried to tase them. And within seconds, the shots were fired. Then what we've learned is that some of the updated trainings in de-escalation and excessive use of force took place after the shootings. So we have armed deputies out there without sufficient training, trying to handle a situation that is way over their head. They didn't call for help, and resulted in the deaths of Gabriel Strickland and Sage Crawford. Now I'm going to introduce Lorraine Wright. She's going to talk about training.
My name is Lorraine Wright. I'm a local attorney at law. I have practiced for 30 years here in Nevada County as a family law and estate planning attorney. And I'm not an expert by any means in the areas of law enforcement or law or criminal law, but I used my legal skills to do the work that I've done that I'm going to present to you tonight. I've been a community activist for over 20 years with the Peace and Justice Center of Nevada County, and I'm a member of the Community Oversight Task Force, a group of local citizens who wished to figure out why we had these incidents that resulted in the death of two young people in the last couple of years. The work that we're doing is in line with the work that's being done by community groups across the nation in dealing with trying to reform law enforcement to better meet the needs of the public, to deal with the safety issues and to deal with the populations that we are dealing with. Locally, of course, we don't have a whole lot of racial derived issues, but we certainly have issues surrounding the homeless, poverty, and the mentally ill and substance abuse populations. In 2015, the California legislature passed SB 11, which has to do with the officers' trainings with respect to people with mental illness. POST, you'll hear the reference to POST frequently during our presentation. POST stands for Police Officers Standards and Training, and that is the state agency that is authorized to implement the law in the areas of criminal law that the legislature mandates. And POST is a governmental agency created by statute that then creates the law and also creates the trainings on how to deal with the new law. So in the area of mental illness, the new law required that trainings all involve the understanding the nature of mental illness and developmental disabilities, how to identify indicators of mental disability, and how to respond appropriately in a variety of common situations. Here's a big one: conflict resolution and de-escalation techniques for individuals with mental disability. And as Polly pointed out, in both cases of Gabriel Strickland and Sage Crawford, who I think it can't well be disputed that they both suffered from some form of mental illness, none of these techniques were employed. Appropriate language when dealing with a person with mental disability, that didn't happen either. Alternatives to lethal force when interceding with persons with mental disabilities. And then, of course, to know that law enforcement must know what are the available community and state resources available to serve and to help out in these situations. I reviewed the training records of 64 sheriff's deputies. With respect to certain areas of law. The first one, as I've just mentioned, is the first category up here, persons suffering from mental disabilities. And what I found was that, by the way, so there's 64 officers' records that we reviewed, and we have only identified 4 of those officers for privacy reasons, and so you'll see that after the initials on the top there, these are the 4 officers involved with the 2 shootings we've talked about, but the rest of the officers are just numbers. And then we have a key that responds to, or coordinates with this. So you'll see that with respect to the mental health training, the 2 officers involved with the Gabriel Strickland killing, Taylor King and Brandon Tripp. The death happened on January 1 of 2020. They didn't get their training until January. They went right away, but following that shooting death in January of 2020. And you'll see that the other officers also began receiving training in mental health and disability in 2020. And you'll see across the board, it just began in 2020. So there was a couple that were earlier. There's a few that were earlier, but for the most part, the serious training began following the death of Gabriel Strickland. So that's the point I'm making there. The next area of law that I considered was the AB 392, which is the new use of force law that was enacted in California in 2019. Due to the high spate of police shootings in California, I think we remember a couple of those that happened in Sacramento. I remember the one involving a young man with a cell phone in his grandmother's backyard, and he was shot and killed. So as a result of the shootings across the nation and these shootings in California, our legislature and Governor Newsom passed a law called the California Act to Save Lives, otherwise known as AB 392. And this landmark law effectively changed the circumstances when law officers can use deadly force, which changed the standards, as I see it, as I read this law, from essentially it's okay to just bring your gun out whenever you feel like you need to a new principle supposed to be guiding our officers' conduct, which is the principle of the sanctity and respect for human life. AB 392 required all law enforcement agencies across the state to develop policies in compliance with the new law and to post the new policies online, on their online website. And of course, to follow the new policies. Required post to create new trainings and courses for all law enforcement agencies to take on the new use of force law. And although the law went into effect in January of 2020, it was supposed to be implemented by January 1 of 2021. So in looking at the police training records for the use of force law, again, we see the 4 officers involved. The 2 in the Gabriel Strickland, they got it right after the event, within a week or something. The others began getting it also in 2021, and as you see, most of these records are in the early 21 area. The yellow, by the way, is where there's no training record on that particular area. Of the 64 officers' records that I reviewed, 37 have had this training as of, I think I got those records a few months ago, so as of that time. But the balance of people, it's just over 50%. The rest of the officers have not had the training yet. You can see this slide shows a lot of training. The new law, which requires our office, the sheriff to develop policies and online. I'll just state a few of the main points. The new law requires that all law enforcement agencies maintain a policy that provides standards on the use of force, a requirement that officers utilize de-escalation techniques, crisis intervention techniques, and other alternatives to force whenever possible. I searched the Sheriff's Online Policy Manual, and I could not find any detail on how to implement de-escalation or how to implement alternative tactics. The requirement that an officer use only that level of force necessary that they reasonably believe is proportional to the offense that was the suspected offense that the individual was responsible for. What I found in the Sheriff's Manual is that there's statements that say this, but there's no elaboration. There's no development of policy or practices, and I do believe that it is the essence of the law that our officers need to be trained. They can't just be told, you're going to go out there and enforce the law with no bias and no prejudice, for instance. And that's all it says. There's no elaboration. So the requirement for clear and specific guidelines to when an officer may or may not draw a firearm or point it at a person. I didn't even find that in our sheriff's. A comprehensive and specific guidelines for the application of deadly force. I mean, this is serious law, but I don't feel that our sheriff, in implementing the policy online, has really complied with the essence of this law. Training and guidelines regarding vulnerable populations, including but not limited to children, elderly persons, persons who are pregnant, people with physical, mental, and developmental disabilities. I didn't see anything on that. So I believe our sheriff's policy falls short, and it's among our recommendations that this law be reviewed and elaborated, and that a policy, a real serious policy, be developed. Speaking of the Sheriff's Online Policy Manual, you can see for yourself, I found it to be poorly organized, if indeed there's organization at all. It lacks following a logical sequence. It took me a long time to find the use of force, the quote use of force policy, and I mean, which is, by the way, published twice. And you know, it's not user friendly. And if we expect our officers to be following a policy, then it needs to be stated clearly, and for the public to also know that our police or the sheriff is following the law. We need to be able to access that ourselves. That's why the legislator said it's going to be online so that the public can see it. So another area that I looked at training was in the area of racial and cultural diversity. Every police officer in the state is expected to participate in expanded training in this area. The law as written states that the training and policy on racial and cultural diversity shall be part of the Police Academy basic training, no less than 15 hours. But in addition, the law requires refresher courses every 5 years. And this law was initially enacted in 2017. So I looked to see how our sheriff's deputies did. And again, I didn't see, with a few exceptions, I didn't see any training in this area until 2020, 2021. Again, following the deaths that we've been talking about. There's a lot of yellow absences, no training. All 2021, here's a 05. So you see, I mean, just, you know, you get the impression that they didn't get, the sheriffs didn't get serious about this training, these mandates, until after the death of Gabriel Strickland. Like, how does that work? And the reason why I looked at dispatchers was that I was particularly perturbed at what I heard with respect to the Sage Crawford shooting. I listened closely to the sheriff's online video that covered that incident. As I do recall, and I'm just paraphrasing what I heard, the first The caller was describing a woman walking down the road. There had been a dog incident, and she walking down the road, same direction as traffic, and she was had 2 children with her. And the caller said, quote, "She's not well." And then there was a few moments later, another caller who said, a woman with 2 kids came up to my door, and she was fearful for her life. She said someone was following her, and she needed help. She says, the woman asked me for help. She said someone was following her, and she wanted a ride to the state line. That information somehow got turned into the dispatcher calling for police a response, and she called it suspicious circumstances. So that bothered me, and I wanted to know how well are the dispatchers trained. So as you can see from the slide, the dispatchers are required to meet a lot of responsibility. This is all of the various roles they play and the job that it involves. I won't go through reading them, but you can kind of read for yourself. I mean, they basically coordinate all the 911 calls. They supposedly route those calls to the right source, fire department, ambulance, etc. And they also keep in real time communications with the officers who are involved in any kind of serious incident. They are right there every minute, moment, they are tracking information. So it's a very responsible job. And I looked to see, well, what is the training and the qualifications to become a dispatcher? And this is it. They're required to have a 12th grade education and 1 year experience in a setting involving public contact. They must have a valid driver's license. Could be a California or Nevada. And within 30 days of hire. They must complete the POST, that's the Post Police Officer Standards and Training Dispatch Academy, within 12 months of hire. That means that they can be hired and not even have had the training. They can be on the job, doing the work, but not trained. Well, they have to type. So, as part of our recommendations, we feel that we need our dispatchers who fill a very important role in our community to have at least a couple of years of college, and they need to have that post-training in advance of getting on the job. I also looked into what is the dispatch basic course, how are the dispatchers trained, and these are the categories of the Dispatch Academy at Post. And it's a total of 120 hours, which is basically the equivalent of 3 weeks. And if you go down this list of categories, introduction, interpersonal communication, telephone technology, missing persons, domestic violence, community. Now I looked into the actual curricula for each of these categories, and believe it or not, I didn't find not one reference to dealing with people with mental illness. And I think that's a problem. I think that our dispatchers, as well as our officers, need to be trained in the area of mental illness. They need to know what kind of, information to look for. And then they, of course, need to know who to call. And that's something we'll also be talking about. So, and then the last thing I did was I did a public records request of the Sheriff's Office for my PRR read something like any and all documents that the Sheriff's Office has that categorizes, organizes, itemizes the data from which for the 911 calls. I wanted to know I want to know what are the nature of the calls that we have here in our community. And I know you can't read this, so I made some copies of it, and it's on the back table. But just to give you a little flavor, there are, we have calls for animal-related issues. We have calls for crime, assault and battery. We have bear calls. We have boat calls, bomb threats, Citizens Assist Standby. This is an alphabetical quote categorization, but there's no elaboration on these areas. And what I'm specifically looking at is the category of medical calls, which was the largest. The dispatch center received, this is a 3-year record. The dispatch center received over 3,000 calls each year that are categorized as, quote, medical calls. And among our recommendations to the sheriff's office is that she develop a meaningful method of data collection and organization and elaboration, especially on medical calls, so that the public, so that we as a community can know, do we need more officers out there because we have more crime to deal with? Or do we need less officers because we are dealing with people with mental health crises or illness or the homeless or those kinds of social issues? Again, there's a couple copies of this in the back and you can see for yourself. I was quite shocked to see this. I thought in fact, I had ongoing communication with the administrative officer in the sheriff's department. He didn't even know what I was asking for initially, and I kept having to describe, don't you have, like, where's your records of what dispatch answers? And he said, well, let me see what I can do. And somehow he pulled this up. He said it was from their, some sort of computer program. I don't know. That is all that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to turn the floor over to Polly again. Thank you, Polly.
Okay, so what we're talking about here tonight is how does our law enforcement, our sheriff's deputies respond to crisis. So after the Gabriel Strickland shooting, almost a year later, Sheriff Moon decided to fund a program of a crisis response team. And that crisis response team was implemented last December 2020. And what it consists of is an undedicated sheriff's deputy and a licensed mental health worker funded by behavioral health. They ride in the car together. An undedicated sheriff's deputy means that he's not dedicated strictly to the crisis team. He can be out on another call. And therefore, that mental health worker is also in that call with him. So, say, for instance, on the day that Sage Crawford was killed, what we found out directly from the sheriff, she said one of the team members was out sick that day. But there was no backup crisis person to call. No one called behavioral health. They didn't call their supervisor to come and help, nothing. So the crisis response team is available 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday. Sage was killed on a Thursday, and they're only available certain hours of the day, so not 24/7. So they're available on a very, very limited basis. So that's a problem because, as we know, we have a crisis in Nevada County 24/7, and we need to have that kind of crisis response. And it has to be dedicated to the crisis team. It can't be, oh well, they're out somewhere else and they can't come. So that doesn't work out too well. Now, I was able to get some figures from Phoebe Bell at Behavioral Health as far as the number of calls that came in or that they responded to from December 2020 to August this year. And they responded to 212 crisis calls. Now, Lorraine just mentioned that each year there's approximately 3,000 calls, medical calls. We don't know exactly what they were, but we're assuming that a large percentage these days are for people who are houseless or drug addicted or mentally ill. So 212 crisis responses is not going to be enough to cover the need. So out of the 212 calls, there were 68 referrals, which means when they show up, then the person is referred to some place. So 29 individuals were referred to the home team. Now the home team either takes people to hospitality house or finds them housing or some other situation to get them sort of stabilized. There were 24 that went to Adult Protective Services. 14 people in crisis went to the crisis unit at the hospital. 4 went to Community Beyond Violence. 3 were referred to Nevada County Behavioral Health for therapy. There were 3 outpatient patients to behavioral health. And then there were 30 5150 holds. Now a 5150 hold is when a person is a danger to themselves or others. So that's a mental health hold, and they're taken to the crisis unit at the hospital. It's a 72-hour hold normally. Sometimes they don't hold them that long. But, so those were the types of, things that happen once the crisis team arrived at that location. Well, there have now been 2 grand jury reports on the topic of body-worn cameras. And so in September of 2018, the Federal Office of the Attorney General awarded Nevada County funding for body-worn cameras in the amount of $123,000. And the term for completing this grant was on September 30th of this year. So there was an article in the Union in July talking about a Board of Supervisors meeting, and the sheriff was going to purchase the body cameras, and also she was going to purchase the software that went with the body cameras, and also she wanted to buy the equipment to interface the body cameras with the dashboard cameras on the cars. Now, we don't know whether all this has been accomplished yet, as far as all this being put together, but in this year's budget, in addition to all of the things that I mentioned, she wanted to identify personnel to do video redactions for the California Public Records Request, which is Senate Bill 1421. She wanted to identify office space for confidential records and videos to be redacted. She wanted to acquire the necessary personnel and equipment to perform the redaction pursuant to California state law. So, as far as we know, they're still on the shelf. They haven't been implemented yet. And, everybody's been asking for body cameras. The Grass Valley Police have body cameras. So does Nevada City Police. They have body cameras, so there's no reason we can see that the body cameras haven't been implemented yet. All right, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Rick Robbins.
Hi, my name is Rick Robbins. I'm a 25-year resident of Nevada County. One of the reasons I live here in part is because it's a safe community, and I'd like to keep it that way. Part of our examination of law enforcement in the county is to include evaluation of whether our money is being spent effectively. The primary role of law enforcement is public safety. However, there are lots of other programs and services that contribute to public safety. In the process of looking into how the county allocates our money, I stumbled across a study, listed across the bottom here, called How California Counties Are Spending Their Public Safety Realignment Funds. The report compares spending on law enforcement to spending on programs and services. For law enforcement, this map of the various counties shows that Nevada County is in one of the higher percentiles, in this case 50 to 75% of the county in terms of spending on law enforcement. And in terms of spending on programs and services, we're actually in one of the lower percentiles. Now this covers only spending from one specific program, one specific revenue source. And that isn't necessarily indicative of how the county spends their money across the entire budget. Also, typically this sort of spending varies dramatically depending on the population and the population density of the county. So I decided to look at the budgets of a number of counties of similar size. The red column here is the population of the various counties, so you can see that Humboldt County is about 35% greater than Nevada County, and Sutter, Yuba, Mendocino, Yuba, and Tehama are smaller. The yellow bar shows the percentage of spending on law enforcement as compared to the spending on other services and programs. And you can see that Nevada County is a bit of an outlier. Even though we're a little bit larger than Sutter, Mendocino, Yuba, and Tehama, we spend significantly more, about 75% in ratio, than they do. I should note that while the county's budgets don't always put everything in the same buckets, so it's sometimes hard to make sure that you get everything lined up right. I've done the best I can. There may be a little variance. But they should note that when I say law enforcement, that includes spending on jails and courts, etc., as well as the sheriff's offices. Programs and services are the spending on people, but doesn't include spending on operations and infrastructure. What's important to note on the slide is basically that we're an outlier, and that we need to perhaps ask ourselves, are we actually spending our money the way we should be spending? Right now, we're not going to try to go into that. It's a much more complicated subject than we're going to be able to cover right in this presentation. So it'll be part of something in the future. The next thing I wanted to evaluate, what does law enforcement in the county cost us in terms of insurance claims, basically, where lawsuits and settlements. This information comes from the county's Office of Risk Management. You can see, so far, the sheriff's office up to this point, which was several months ago now, hasn't actually cost us all that much. The bulk of our costs, which total out to about $650,000, it came in the corrections department. And we're not going to cover corrections department here. We'll cover that in a subsequent presentation. But it's the way what I wanted to point out here is that we are spending money on what amounts to insurance. Now, if you ask the county, you say, do we buy liability insurance? The answer is no, we're self-insured. But what they mean is they're part of a program called PRISM, which is a bunch of different counties and municipalities pool their money together. And when there's a claim, the county will pay it out and they'll get reimbursed for a portion of it. But as you can see, it's not a complete reimbursement. So basically, it's kind of like your automobile insurance. You pay a premium and there's a deductible. The premiums over the past 10 years have amounted to $5.5 million, which is pretty significant. But those don't include costs for the more recent. They would only give me information on completely closed claims. So anything more recent than the last couple of years is not in here. So how's that worked out? So Nevada County's payments to PRISM have gone up dramatically from about $373,000 a year to currently over $1 million a year. The problem being it's going to go up quite a bit more because the way the PRISM premiums are calculated, it's based on both the overall payments throughout the state or throughout all the various municipalities and counties that are in that group joint fund, but it's also based on the experience of the individual county. So if we see an increase in our claims, our premiums to PRISM are going to go up significantly, as well as because the claims throughout the state have gone up dramatically. So we can expect to see this to rise rather quite a bit in the future. And Personally, $1 million a year, I think that's a pretty significant amount already. So this covers the cost of law enforcement that we're going to cover to this point. We'll have a future, more in-depth version of it. Right now, I'm going to turn you over to Libby Woods.
You can probably hear me a little better than my mask. I am an educator and a concerned citizen, as well as a member of the Citizens Oversight Task Force and a member of the Peace and Justice Center of Nevada County. And I'm here to talk to you about how calling the cops can make communities feel unsafe, particularly communities that have Black people, Indigenous people, brown folks, members of the LGBTQIA, disabled people, sex workers, unhoused people. This population tends to get discriminated against, and they tend to encounter police officers more often. We've witnessed that in our own community with Gabriel Strickland and Sage Crawford. They were both diagnosed and potentially undiagnosed with mental illness, and they were killed in our community. Native people are 2.2 times more likely to be killed by police than white folks, according to the CDC. Black Americans are more than 3 times likely to be killed by police than white people, according to the Harvard School of Public Health. As we've seen in previous slides with Lorraine, police officers don't have the type of training to properly manage folks that are having a mental illness. And it's really unfair to them to be put in these situations that they're not trained to deal with. And it also can be kind of lethal and make people feel pretty unsafe. So this is not just a local issue, this is actually a nationwide situation where we're trying to come up with some new solutions instead of sending police to these mental health crisis calls. So there's a new law that was passed October 8th, signed by the governor, AB 118. This is a law that's being put forth in every state in the country right now, and they're all adopting it in different ways. But basically, the situations that people are having are very complex. And for police officers to come into a situation, being in a position of power, can immediately escalate someone who is afraid. Someone who is in a uniform, someone who has a weapon, someone who is yelling commands at them, can make them unable to comply. So we know that members of the community, for the people, of the people, people in plain clothes, people with peer support training, people who are qualified in meeting people exactly where they may have a more effective impact on helping these people get to the help that they really need. And it's not only more fiscally effective, but it's also potentially a better solution. So I highly recommend people look this up. It will allocate $250,000 to communities to support a community-based response team that will be available to meet people in crisis. They're trained in harm reduction, de-escalation, peer support, domestic violence situations, even sexual assault. So this is happening all across our state and across the country. Eugene, Oregon has a program called Cahoots. I've been getting to know a lot about them. They've been around for almost 30 years, and they've become integrated into the county system. And they dispatch to the scene where people are having a mental health crisis. They're Sacramento, San Francisco, Oakland, Denver, San Diego. They're all incorporating various forms within the county, and then community-based organizations are also popping up to meet the needs of their community, because they see this as a growing need and it needs to be addressed. So there's a lot of locally there is a lot of effort to try to build this kind of community-based response, because we want to take care of our people. We don't want to see what happened to Sage Crawford and Gabriel Strickland happen again. So we're hoping to get that off the ground and get support from the community. Thank you so much.
We've talked a number of times about concerns about how law enforcement deals with the people having mental health issues. However, we can't forget that law enforcement personnel are people, and they're members of our community as well. I want to take a moment to read this quote from a report by the American Police Officers Association. A lot of police officers fear that they will be unable to perform their duties if they are deemed to be mentally unhealthy. This potential varies depending on the state, but it shouldn't stop any police officer from getting the help that they need. Frankly, officers don't like to admit that they might have some sort of mental issue. They're typically not recognized to train to recognize PTSD in themselves. And they're often unaware that PTSD can result from long-term stress in their personal lives, not just horrible incidents like war or major catastrophes. Because the diagnosis is detrimental to their careers, they're typically unwilling to acknowledge that they might have issues. And their stresses from their jobs and personal lives can result in substance abuse, depression, and the statistics show that the rate of suicide among police officers is about 150% higher than the average public. The bottom line is that officers who are not trained to recognize their own mental health issues are going to be less aware and compassionate with others who have mental health or other struggles. I'm only going to present this slide briefly. Basically, it's to show these are based on articles and different reports that programs that are taking place around the country to serve the law enforcement officers' mental health. It's important that we destigmatize law enforcement's mental health, and let's not expect the officers to be superhuman. They're people like all of us. They have family issues, they have financial issues, whatever. So they need to be treated just like the rest of us, and like we expect them to treat others. So one of the recommendations are that they designate superiors, mentors, or trainers who are responsible for the deputy staff mental health checks, especially after a post-critical incident. So if there's some major incident, make sure that someone gets in touch with them and goes through how they're feeling about it. There are lots of ideas from the case studies that I showed just in the previous slide that the Sheriff's Office could implement. They should offer tactical focus to improve the officer's mental capacity and their ability to deal with a situation and separate that situation from whatever else is going on in their lives or their personal biases or whatever. So then the supervisors and trainers should take a lead by joining in the classes and offering incentives for participation, such as paying for the mental health classes. Now that we'd like to get into the Community Oversight Task Force recommendation for the Sheriff's Office on community policing. Essentially, integrating every officer into the community so that they feel part of it and are not isolated in their own law enforcement bubble. Most of us are probably familiar with something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Food, shelter, and security being among the most basic. When people's needs, those needs aren't met, we can expect conflict and strife as people strive to meet them. Law enforcement is an integral part of our society. It isn't going to go away. So it's vitally important that our law enforcement contribute to the sense of security and not make us feel less safe. When you look at this image of the Sheriff's MRAP vehicle, mine-resistant vehicle, does it actually make you feel more safe? Personally, I think a more useful vehicle would be a Sheriff's Department ice cream truck and have them serve ice cream on Saturday afternoons on Mill Street, or hot chocolate during the winters. Community policing is about being part of connecting with and being part of the community. First and foremost, our officers need to interact with the community on a personal level. Get out of the vehicles. When we see sheriffs, they're almost always in their cars. We'd like to see them and get to know them. They should get to know us. They should spend more time out of their vehicles, and that could involve special events, meet and greets, coffee with cops, or just walking around. They should collaborate with individuals and organizations in the community to develop solutions and increase trust in law enforcement. Law enforcement organizations should be structured and aligned to the community needs. Officers should have a guardian mentality rather than a military one. They're part of our community, not separate from it. All too often, the officers that are hired are former military, and that's the mindset they come in with. Somehow we need to kind of get them free from that mindset and start to think that it's back to the old protect and serve mindset. There should be ongoing evaluation of how law enforcement is serving the community and how to improve it, And now I'm going to turn you back to Libby.
Yeah, with for there to be a peer-based community response team. People who are members of the community, who are familiar with the people who they're going to be responding to. A lot of these calls with mental health are people who are unhoused. People who, being unhoused is not a crime, and cycling them through the jail is not helping them. Sometimes they get the runaround through from behavioral health. And there needs to be like another peer-based group that can connect them to resources that is not going to stigmatize them, not respond in a punitive manner, and treat them with dignity. So that's my recommendation, is for people who are members of these communities, regular folks, to be trained in peer support, behavioral health, mental illness, drug abuse, and have connections with folks that tend to be marginalized. They kind of get pushed to the fringe of the society. For them to be treated like human beings that need help, instead of being discriminated against and treated like lesser than. And so a peer-based group would be able to dispatch to these people in this situation, provide hot beverage, sit on the curb with them, see if they can take them to a safer location, bring them a sleeping bag, be able to, be a legal observer if they're being harassed. So I think it could really help people no longer be pushed to the fringe of the society and feel like they're always in trouble. So yeah, and I think it should be funded and be available 24/7, and it needs to happen ASAP. Yeah, people who are not in uniform. I kind of covered that already. And culturally relevant care, community-based support that entails members of the community that have a diverse background and understanding of the inherent biases. Providing support and care for Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQIA, disabled people, sex workers, unhoused people, people who are undocumented, people who use drugs, and neurodivergent people. Because none of these things are crimes. They're just people who need help and don't get accepted.
These are the recommendations that we're making to our sheriff's office. We feel that we want the policies to be accurately and appropriately posted online, developed and posted online. We want our officers to get the training that they need. We feel they should have at least biannual trainings for dealing with persons with mental illness, because that's what our community has. We have a lot of people with this kind of problems. The same for the use of force policies, that they must be in compliance with AB 392, and emphasizing the guiding principle of the sanctity of human life. How can we prevent death? How can we de-escalate, use crisis intervention techniques? I'm going to recommend that the sheriff posts use of force standards and guidelines publication. It's all spelled out really well for them. Published in October of 2020. We want to be sure that our officers take updated trainings in implicit bias. They have to understand that they may have their own personal biases. It takes some understanding and training to get that. I work in the courts, as you know, and judges have to take this kind of implicit bias training, because we may not realize that we hold deeply ingrained prejudices, and law enforcement officers are the same. We need to have these trainings so that they can recognize biases within themselves. I'm recommending that the sheriff improve its organization of its online web page and policy manual. Again, if we want the public to understand the policy, if we want our officers to understand the policy, it needs to be elaborated and completely stated online. Oh yeah. Okay, then Holly, you're going to wrap up with the final recommendations.
Thank you. We want to require that there be a minimum of 4 hours mental health training biannually for dispatchers to recognize calls involving mental illness, homelessness, and emotional crises, so they can relay the appropriate information to the deputies out there in the field, and also call the crisis team if they think it's necessary to call the crisis team themselves. We want to require that dispatchers have at least 2 years of college for eligibility and completion of the post-dispatch training prior to being hired, not after. One thing that has come to our attention is that some officers do use medications, whether they are prescription medications or perhaps street drugs. And so after a shooting incident, the sheriff actually has a policy requiring drug testing within 4 hours of a police shooting to make sure that the guys are not physically or mentally impaired by any medication that they may be taking or any street drugs. Now, what has happened is that the drug tests were not taken after these shootings, and maybe the deputies opted out, but it should be mandatory that they cannot opt out of being drug tested following a shooting incident or an incident where somebody is severely injured. That has to be mandatory. There's no opting out. If they opt out, they have to be off the force.
Do you mean by the officer? The officer should be tested, or
Yes,
the criminal?
The officers involved in the shooting,
Okay.
yes. Okay. Then the prompt release of all records following the use of force incidents causing injury or death. Now, there's a new law, it's a couple years old on the books, AB 1421. When we first started asking for the records following the Gabriel Strickland shooting, because as you remember, that happened over a year and a half ago, and the district attorney put out their report settling the case last October. So when we started to ask for documents, we weren't getting them. And then we had to remind the Sheriff's Department and County Council about AB 1421 that requires the release of documents after a shooting. So it's been like pulling teeth getting the documents that we needed in a timely manner. There needs to be mental health testing prior to hiring and regular ongoing subsequent mental health testing. There's a lot of tests out there now to determine if a person has any kind of underlying mental health issues. So all this screening is really important before a person is out there with a loaded weapon. That's one of our main points here. No carrying of access to weapons if on mental health medication. So the Grass Valley Police have a very set in stone policy that if a person is on prescription medication, they have to tell their supervisor. Their supervisor then decides if they can be out there in the field, depending on what the side effects of that medication are, or if they're going to be impaired, say, driving. I mean, when we take some medications, it says right there on the label, don't drive, don't use heavy machinery. Well, you certainly don't want to be out there with a gun. Immediate implementation of body cameras. And yeah, so this has been going on for years. We all know that we want body cameras, so we're asking the sheriff to please, just get them on.